I'm sure you could tell right away that Zoro and Sanji were going to be Luffy's right and left-hand men. And we even have a name for them now, the Wings of the future Pirate King. And now that we know that Luffy is Joyboy, or something like that, is it possible that Joyboy also had his own wings back in the Void Century? I tend to think so. But first, I need to talk about the most important monster trio. The subscribe button, like button, and notification bell.
Stop right there! Stop! No, stop!
But onto the theory. Outside of Zoro and Sanji, the most obvious example of a pair of wings that we have in the story of One Piece is Silvers Rayleigh and Scopper Gaban, and their names even line up in such a way to make that obvious. But you can even trace this structure back to the beginning of the story, with Buggy, Kabaji, and Moji, as well as Lucci, Kaku, and Jabra. Many other pirate groups famously have a 3-commander system, but even then, most crews have a clear difference between the top 2 and the third. Take King, Queen, and Jack, for example. Not only are the names indicative of a hierarchy, but they claim just as much in their introduction. And their bounties are 390 and 320 million higher than Jack's too, so there's just a clear separation from second to third. For Big Mom, I would actually argue that her most important members are Perospero and Katakuri, as opposed to one of her other 2 or 3 commanders. But whether you agree or disagree on the last one, there's obviously a common theme here with every successful leader having 2 reliable wings to back them up. Using this logic, it would be strange for Joyboy to not have his own wings back in the Void Century. Despite his apparent loss versus the world government, he is undoubtedly one of the most powerful and successful people that we have heard of in all of One Piece. So I imagine that his wings were of a similar caliber to the likes of those in Luffy's or Roger's crew. And if Joyboy returned 800 years later by Luffy awakening his fruit, then maybe Joyboy's wings have returned in some form as well, likely involving some type of inherited will. And the most obvious option that might jump out at you is Sanji and Zoro's ancestors, which is technically possible, but that type of destiny plotline just seems too basic for Oda to do. And despite both of these characters likely having important families, there isn't a lot of foreshadowing for this connection to be the reason. So then I considered if there are any other 2 individuals with consistent ties to Joyboy, and I considered Luffy and Kaido. Luffy obviously is Joyboy, or something like that at least, and Kaido has been almost baiting out Joyboy for some unknown reason. His ties to rocks and his long history of piracy likely mean that he knows a lot more than we do. So I dug deeper into what we do know about Kaido and his connection to Wano, and that's when everything really started to hit me. The one who seemed to initiate Kaido's move into Wano was primarily Higurashi. She and the old guy with the barrier fruit, named Semimaru, coerced Orochi into taking over Wano and were absolutely essential in Orochi accomplishing that. And then we learned that Higurashi was apparently the very first one to bring up the idea of moving to Wano to Kaido during his flashback. And she also interfered with Kaido's battle with Oden by becoming Momo, thus ensuring that Kaido stayed in power even though Kaido killed her afterward. And something that I'm sure you and I have both considered peculiar about these 2 is that they have the Mane Mane no Mi and the Bari Bari no Mi, which belong to Mr. 2 and Bartolomeo. I mean, what are the odds that the 2 fruits that facilitated Kaido's reign and Joyboy's return now belong to the 2 biggest fans of the modern day Joyboy?
We have been hoodwinked, bamboozled, led astray, run amok.
Now, while their overall goal was to bring the Kurizumis back to power, the way that they did so was by recruiting Kaido and bringing him to Wano. And we all know that Kaido said the only way he would be defeated was by the hands of Joyboy. And then when you consider the fact that those fruits now belong to the biggest fans of the modern day Joyboy, being Luffy, and that they have saved him on several occasions despite barely knowing him on a personal level, that coincidence is just way too big for me to ignore.
I just don't know what to say about this. Look, man.
And on top of that, Joyboy apparently returned because of a specific devil fruit. So wouldn't it also make sense that Joyboy's wings would have something to do with other fruits? And what are the 2 fruits outside of Luffy's that have had a consistent connection to Joyboy? Yes, if you haven't put it all together by now, I think the Clone and the Barrier fruits could have belonged to the wings of Joyboy.
Don't get me salivating and fantasizing about things.
I also think these fruits are even more important than we've realized, despite them already being involved in several major arcs. This kind of begs the question on how these fruits were coincidentally eaten by these important Joyboy related people. When the Gorosei first mentioned that Luffy's fruit was actually the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika, they also mentioned that zone fruits have a will of their own, and that seems to be how Luffy's fruit evaded the world government for so long. And this could even be the reason why it ultimately ended up being eaten by Luffy after that altercation with Shanks in Makino's bar. This seems to heavily imply that the fruit is choosing its user in some way, although the means of which are uncertain. Given that Luffy ended up awakening and becoming Joyboy, it also seems that the fruits are pretty good at choosing the right user. And while the Gorosei did specifically say zones, I think there's plenty of evidence of the same thing happening with Paramecia and Logia types. One of the absolute best examples of this is actually the Horo Horo no Mi that belongs to Perona. For starters, she is just a huge fan of horror stuff in general, but also her laugh is literally while the fruit's name is the Horo Horo no Mi. You can't tell me that this is all a coincidence. And a similar thing exists for Whitebeard. I mean, first off, earthquakes and the world's strongest man go hand in hand, but his laugh is literally which matches the fruit's name again. You could even dig a little deeper and say that the original 3 admirals had fruits that fit their personalities very well. Akainu's anger and Aokiji's relaxing nature fit the magma and ice fruit perfectly, and then Kizaru is lazy but can go the speed of light, which is just an obvious juxtaposition from Oda. And I think Blackbeard having the dark fruit is another example, since he is a cunning and scummy character, and he even claimed that his fruit chose him, and he told Luffy that getting the Mera would be just like having Ace on his crew. So now we have to go all the way back to the old couple from Wano, because if we make this assumption that the devil fruits tend to be eaten by people who are a good match, then what is it about these two that make them a good fit for the wings of someone benevolent like Joyboy? Well, while their measures were certainly cruel, these two were explicitly responsible for bringing Kaido to power, and thus the raid that resulted in Joyboy returning. If those two had recruited someone just as strong as Kaido but maybe was kinder than him, then Joyboy may not have returned today because Joyboy would not have been needed to come liberate Wano. Now, I know that's a bit of a stretch, but maybe the fruits could tell that these people were going to bring someone that would actually help Joyboy return in the future. And to be clear, I'm not proposing that these two did what they did for the conscious purpose of bringing Joyboy back. They may have had no idea who Joyboy even was, but being aware of the fruit's will doesn't really seem to be a requirement. I mean, after all, Luffy never has nor ever will want to be Sun God Nika or Joyboy, and he has already said as much. There seems to be a layer of matching wills of some sort between the user and the fruit. Now, how that manifests seems to be different for everybody, but if the Nika fruit knew that this kid in the East Blue could be Joyboy someday, I don't think it's a stretch at all to say that the Mane Mane no Mi and the Bari Bari no Mi knew that this old couple in Wano would aid in the return of Joyboy in the future. And if this is truly the case, then the current owners of the fruit, Bon Clay and Bartolomeo, should be helping Joyboy in some way. And what do you know, they are undoubtedly Luffy's biggest fans in the verse, outside of the crew at least. And what's unique about these two is that they feel this close to Luffy despite having almost no reason to. They became best friends with Luffy basically on sight. And this is especially true for Bon Clay. Bon Clay has commented on several occasions how much he values his friendship with Luffy, specifically saying that time does not determine the strength of their friendship. Yet Luffy has done absolutely nothing for Bon Clay. First off, Bon Clay was defeated by Sanji, captured by the Marines twice while allowing Luffy to escape, and he even risked his life going back to level 5 just to have a chance to save Luffy from the poison. All because of their very brief friendship. But perhaps that friendship is actually longer than either of them realize. And this plot gets even crazier if you check out our first meeting with Bon Clay. He demands to charge ahead into this cloud of steam and somehow grabs Karoo and then is saved by the Straw Hats. Then almost immediately, Mr. 2 reveals that he has a devil fruit and shows them the powers. And then he even says later that this isn't something I ordinarily show others. So why would he show them those powers immediately? They even become so friendly that they start dancing around together. And don't get me wrong, this could be just because Mr. 2 is a super friendly guy, but he is the third ranking member in a criminal organization, so he's not that good of a guy. But perhaps his friendliness is part of why the fruit chose him. The fruit knew that he is a friendly guy, and even though he is a villain and has probably done some bad things, when he were to meet Joyboy, he would be able to, be friends with him. What makes this section all the crazier is on the same page where we first see Mr. 2, we get this comment from Usopp. He says that Luffy won't live that long if he is a human, that is. Given the new context of Luffy's fruit and the fact that Usopp has become a bit of a prophet by having a number of his lies come true, this is definitely some type of foreshadowing from Oda. But how weird is it that just a page later, Bon Clay is demanding his crew to charge straight ahead into the steam just to ultimately find the Straw Hat ship. And then when Bon Clay reveals his powers, of all the faces he could show them, he shows them Cobra's face. If Mr. 2 didn't reveal his powers this early on, then the Straw Hats would have had a much harder time in Alabasta, and probably would have even lost the entire confrontation. That was the entire reason they had the bandages on their arm hiding the X, which really came in handy when Mr. 2 disguised himself as Usopp. It's almost like Bon Clay was effectively helping Joyboy survive by revealing his powers to Luffy. And the fact that it directly follows a comment from a prophet like Usopp that Luffy may not be human is just way too much foreshadowing for me to ignore. And while this last part may be a bit of a stretch, the very last face that we see Mr. 2 reveal to us is this one. Right as he is proclaiming that a face I've touched in the past, I do not forget. This face is even after Cobra's, and of all people, we see Zoro's reaction to it. I have asked around and nobody has recognized this person, so if you know who this is, please leave a comment below because I would love to know. And while it seems like it might just be a random throw-in character, I think this is a hint as to what Joyboy's wing looked like that had the Mane Mane no Mi 800 years ago. If Mr. 2 never forgets a face that he has touched, then is it possible that he can remember faces of past users or potentially just awakened users? I also think that this could mean that the user of the Mane Mane was the Zoro of the two wings. I mean, Bon Clay's other name is literally Mr. 2, and Zoro is number 2 on the Straw Hats. He was the second overall member after Luffy, and Sanji obviously has a very consistent 3 motif given his name, his family, and the fact that he typically fights the third strongest combatant. But we still need to talk about Bartolomeo, who also has just as little reason to feel so dedicated to Luffy. He didn't even personally meet Luffy until he created and led a Straw Hat themed pirate crew into the New World. He just saw Luffy survive in Logtown and then dedicated literally his entire life to him. And as with most of this theory, we're entering into some tinfoil territory, but perhaps that lightning strike that saved Luffy was, some kind of signal to the Bari Bari fruit that Joyboy has returned. And so from that point on, that's what made Bartolomeo so compelled. And again, I don't know if the will of the fruit really overtakes the person like that. There's probably some manifestation in between the person's personality and the fruit's. However, maybe what happened at Logtown was some kind of trigger for the fruit, and that's why Bartolomeo felt this way. And if Mr. 2 is the Zoro among Joyboy's wings, then that would mean Bartolomeo is the Sanji of Joyboy's wings, which at first may not make a lot of sense, especially considering the hair color, but another way to look at wings could be kind of a sword and a shield, right? Zoro would obviously be the sword in this case, and Sanji is a very protective, defensive, preventative type of guy who now has genetic enhancements to be nearly indestructible. So it makes sense for him to be compared to someone who literally makes impenetrable shields. This would also mean that Mr. 2 is the sword, and this makes sense because both times that we have seen this fruit in action, they were dismantling entire governments by tricking those within it via its powers. It's a potentially much stronger tool in terms of altering the powers of the world than any sword could ever hope to be. So to sum this whole theory up, I think Joyboy's wings were the users of the Mane Mane and the Bari Bari no Mis, and much like Luffy's fruit and several others, they have picked certain users throughout time that would carry on their wills. We first saw this with the old couple in Wano who brought Kaido, who drew out Joyboy, and now these fruits are owned by Luffy's 2 biggest fans, Mr. 2 and Bartolomeo. I think that you can expect these two to have an even bigger role as we get closer to the end of the story and learn even more about the true history. If you made it all the way to the end, then you probably like this video at least a little bit. So please drop a like and subscribe so I know to keep making content just like this one. Peace.